The courtroom was packed, every seat taken, the air heavy with anticipation. The sound of shackles echoed as the accused was escorted inside, his steps slow and deliberate. The judge adjusted his glasses, prepared to maintain the stern image required of him. But when his eyes lifted to the prisoner's face, his heart skipped a beat. He knew that face. Memories surged back uninvited. Two boys running barefoot through dusty streets, laughing as they shared secrets no one else knew. The man standing in chains was not just another case file, he was a ghost from the judge's own childhood. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, but the judge quickly masked his reaction. His gavel struck down with force, silencing the room. Outwardly, he was calm, commanding authority. Inwardly, he was shaken. How had this boy, his boyhood protector, his friend, become the man accused of such grave crimes? The prosecution began with confidence, presenting evidence that seemed damning. They spoke of theft, betrayal, and violence, painting the accused as someone who had chosen a dark path without remorse. Each word fell like lead in the judge's chest. He remembered nights when that same boy had shared his bread with him when neither of them had enough. He remembered promises whispered under starlight, "We'll make it out of this life together." Now, it seemed one had risen, while the other had fallen. Witnesses took the stand, each testimony cutting deeper. The accused sat silently, shoulders hunched, refusing to look anywhere but at the floor. The judge kept watching, hoping for a flicker of the friend he once knew. Then, during the introduction of a key piece of evidence, the man's composure cracked. His lips quivered, his jaw clenched as if fighting words that demanded to be spoken. For a brief second, their eyes met. No one else noticed, but in that exchange was a silent message, pleading, desperate, and full of unspoken truths. When recess was called, the judge retreated to his chambers. Alone, he let the mask fall. He leaned forward, elbows on his desk, face buried in his hands. His oath demanded fairness, demanded that he weigh only the facts, not his heart. But how could he? The boy who once saved him from bullies, who once swore they'd face the world together, was now at the mercy of his gavel. "What happened to you?" the judge whispered to the empty room, his voice breaking. The defense's turn brought revelations that shifted the tone of the entire trial. It was revealed that the accused had not acted out of selfish greed but out of desperation. He had stepped into crime to shield someone he loved, entangled in a world too dangerous to escape. The details painted not a villain, but a man cornered by impossible choices. The judge felt his breath catch. He could see that same boy, the one who had always sacrificed for others, shining faintly through the years of hardship. When the moment of judgment arrived, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The judge spoke with a steady voice, but every syllable carried the weight of sorrow. He delivered a sentence that upheld the law but allowed for the possibility of redemption. Strict enough to satisfy justice, merciful enough to preserve hope. The crowd reacted with surprise, but their voices faded into nothing compared to the silent exchange between the two men. The accused finally raised his head. His eyes met the judge's, and in them was a storm of emotions, gratitude, regret, sorrow, and the faintest glimmer of the boy he once was. The gavel struck, marking the end of the trial. But for the judge, and for the man in chains, it was more than a verdict. It was the closing of one chapter, and the fragile promise of another that might still be written. The hush of the courtroom felt suffocating as the trial moved forward. Every word from the prosecutor struck like a hammer, each piece of evidence adding weight to the image of a man who had abandoned all traces of honor. The audience leaned in, whispering their judgments, while the accused sat hunched, hands clenched in his lap, as if bracing against invisible blows. The judge listened, but his mind drifted to another time. He remembered when this same man, then just a boy, had stood taller than his years, shielding him from cruelty. The laughter they once shared echoed faintly in his mind, clashing cruelly with the image before him. He wanted to believe this man could not be guilty of such darkness. Yet the papers, the testimonies, and the solemn faces around him demanded he face the possibility that his oldest friend had truly fallen. As the witnesses were called, the case grew heavier. A shopkeeper recounted threats. A neighbor claimed betrayal. Each word carved another wound in the judge's heart. He studied the accused closely, searching for signs of remorse or denial, but the man's silence was a wall. Only once, when a damning piece of evidence was placed on the table, did his mask slip. His lips trembled, his hands tightened against the restraints, and for the briefest second, his eyes flicked up, locking with the judge's. That moment, unnoticed by anyone else, felt like a lifetime. The silence between them spoke louder than any argument. It was a look that asked, "Do you still see me? Do you still remember who I was?" The judge forced himself to look away, hiding the turmoil raging inside. The law demanded his focus. Yet behind his calm expression, memories collided with the present, two boys swearing to stand by each other forever, now standing worlds apart, divided by crime and justice. The courtroom lights seemed harsher as the next phase of the trial unfolded. Witness after witness stepped forward, their words shaping a picture of guilt so sharp it could cut through steel. Yet every sentence weighed heavier on the judge than on the accused himself. He sat in silence, robe straight, face unreadable, but inside his heart throbbed like a drum. The accused never once defended himself. He kept his gaze low, shoulders bent under invisible burdens. The silence was not pride, not defiance, it was something else, something the judge couldn't quite name. Then, in the middle of the prosecution's relentless rhythm, a crucial piece of evidence was laid before the court, documents linking the accused directly to the crime. Gasps spread through the crowd like wildfire. For the first time, the accused flinched. His hands, shackled but strong, clenched tighter. His lips quivered, as if a storm of words pressed against them, desperate to be released. And then, just for a heartbeat, his eyes rose and locked with the judge's. It was not the look of a criminal. It was not the look of a man resigned to his fate. It was the gaze of someone carrying a truth too heavy to speak aloud. In that one silent exchange, the judge felt everything: the weight of desperation, the pull of regret, the unspoken plea for someone, anyone, to see the man he once was. The moment vanished as quickly as it had come, broken by the voice of the prosecutor calling for the next testimony. The accused lowered his eyes again, retreating back into silence. But the judge was no longer the same. That fleeting connection had awakened something deep inside him, a crack in the armor of impartiality, a whisper reminding him that behind every case file and legal charge stood a human soul. When the court recessed, the judge retreated to his chambers, his steps heavy, as though each one dragged the weight of the trial with it. The room, usually a place of order and clarity, now felt suffocating. He closed the door and sank into his chair, resting his elbows on the desk, burying his face in his hands. The mask he wore in the courtroom slipped away, leaving only the man, haunted, conflicted, and torn apart. Memories came rushing back, unbidden. Nights under a sky full of stars when two boys shared their dreams of escaping poverty. Days of mischief and laughter, running through alleyways without fear, promising they would always watch each other's backs. That bond had felt unbreakable, and yet here he was, sitting in judgment of the very boy who once swore to protect him. The judge's oath echoed in his mind. He was bound to the law, sworn to be impartial, to weigh evidence without letting his heart intrude. But how could he separate justice from memory when the man in shackles wasn't just another defendant, but a piece of his own past? His mind battled itself. One voice insisted he must stay firm, justice must be blind. Another whispered that there was more here, a truth hidden beneath the surface that no one else was willing to see. He whispered aloud into the stillness of the room, his voice breaking in the quiet, "What happened to you? How did you end up here?" His words had no answer, but they echoed painfully, like ghosts clinging to the walls. For a long while, he sat motionless, staring at the file on his desk, the cold ink of the charges blurring in his vision. Behind those lines of accusation, he saw the shadow of a boy who once held his hand through hardship. He clenched his fist, steadying himself. When the recess ended, he would walk back into that courtroom wearing the robe of justice again. But deep down, he knew, this case was no longer just about law. It was about loyalty, memory, and the fragile line between judgment and mercy. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere felt different. The defense began presenting its case, and with each word, the rigid walls of guilt that the prosecution had built began to crack. Details emerged that no one in the audience had expected. This was not a story of greed or cruelty, but of desperation. The accused had been cornered, forced into impossible choices to protect someone dear to him. The judge listened with careful focus, but his chest tightened with every revelation. He remembered the boy who had always carried burdens too heavy for his young shoulders, who would give away his own meal just to make sure someone else ate. Now, years later, that same instinct to protect had dragged him into the darkness of crime. It wasn't malice, it was sacrifice. As the defense painted this new picture, the murmurs of the crowd shifted. The villain they had condemned moments ago began to appear as a man trapped by circumstance. And in that moment, the judge saw it clearly: the boy he once knew was still there, hidden behind weariness and regret, flickering like a fading light but not yet extinguished. He felt his throat tighten. Justice was never simple, but now it was tangled with his own memories. The law demanded punishment, yet his heart whispered that mercy was not weakness but recognition of the truth. He sat straighter, steadying his breath, though his mind was in turmoil. The robe on his shoulders felt heavier than it ever had before, as though it carried not just the weight of justice but the burden of friendship, loyalty, and time itself. For the first time since the trial began, the accused lifted his head. His tired eyes scanned the room, then rested on the judge. That look, exhausted, wounded, but quietly pleading, was a silent cry only the judge could hear. It said, "I didn't want this life. I tried to protect what I loved. Do you remember me?" The judge held his gaze a moment longer than he should have, before looking back down at the papers in front of him. His face remained firm, unreadable, but inside, he felt a storm he could no longer contain. When the time for the verdict arrived, the courtroom fell into a silence so deep it seemed the very walls were holding their breath. The judge sat tall, his gavel resting lightly in his hand, but inside his chest his heart was pounding like a war drum. He had listened to both sides, weighed the evidence, and examined every testimony. Yet what lay before him was not just a case, it was a life, one bound to his own by threads of memory and loyalty that no passage of time could sever. He cleared his throat, his voice firm as he began to speak. This court has considered the arguments, the evidence, and the circumstances surrounding this case. Each word carried the gravity of law, but also the ache of personal sorrow. The audience leaned forward, straining to hear, waiting for the strike that would seal the man's fate. The sentence was delivered with precision, but beneath its firmness was a touch of mercy. It was not absolution, justice demanded accountability, but it was not destruction either. It was a sentence that carried the possibility of redemption, the chance for a man to rebuild even after falling so far. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, some shocked by the leniency, others relieved. But the noise faded quickly, drowned out by the silence that passed between the judge and the accused. Slowly, the man lifted his eyes. For the first time since entering that room in chains, he looked directly at his old friend, the boy now cloaked in authority. In his gaze was a storm of emotions, regret so deep it could drown, gratitude so raw it burned, and the faintest glimmer of hope, fragile but alive. The judge met that look steadily, his face unreadable to the room, but his heart spoke what his lips could not. "I remember you. I see you still." The gavel struck, echoing like thunder in the chamber. The trial was over, but for the two men, something unspoken lingered. One walked out in chains, the other remained seated in the robe of justice, yet both carried the weight of the past and the fragile promise of what the future might still hold. The crowd dispersed, voices buzzing with judgment and speculation, but neither man heard them. Their silent exchange had said more than words ever could. And though divided by law and fate, a bond, tested, scarred, but unbroken, remained between them, enduring beyond verdicts and beyond time.